is everyone this evening? Good, good, good. Well, we'll see where we go with this evening. I got a few images on the thing. We had gone over those particular like first century world backgrounds, and there had been some, this is not specifically related to that, but there had been some thought to look at I guess the four kingdoms might be the way to put it. If you recall from Daniel chapter 2, you have the statue. And it's also later reaffirmed with the beast in Daniel 7 or 8. Getting some background on some of these and how they interact can be of interest. In the dream that Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadnezzar, depending on how you pronounce it, he sees this statue, head of gold, breastplate, top of silver, then you have bronze, and then the feet of iron and clay. And the way that this particular graphic, which is put together by our brethren at Bible.ca, which would make them Canadian, there's some interesting stuff there. It focuses on the fact that during this fourth kingdom, of course, this rock will come and will destroy, and it'll create a kingdom that will never be destroyed. I want to hold a pin on that a little bit, because we're going to circle back to that just at the end, because there's always been that question of how do others deal with this notion, because it's pretty clear that this kingdom is going to come in the fourth kingdom, right? But they have a way of doing it, which is wrong, but just to be aware of. So we'll circle back to that. But with this, you have Babylon, you have the Medo-Persians, primarily Persians, basically. You have the Greeks, and you have Rome. And a lot of this changing and raising, and there's a whole lot of, I have notes here full of just dates and figures, and the trick is not to make them so, and then this happened, and then this happened, but to kind of set the stage. But if you really want to follow this, you actually have to start with a kingdom before Babylon, really. Because Assyria, which is before Babylon, was one of the first, or maybe arguably the first, empire to cover that kind of an area. Egypt came close, the Phoenicians with the Carthaginians we'll see, but Assyria was one of the very first to form an empire, and it was from there that Babylon was sort of born, kind of. How familiar are we with these different things? Maybe I should just put that there, because a lot of times we throw these names out there and we're just kind of like, and that's there. Assyria, a lot of the dating gets all over the place, but it seems to show up on the scene around 2025 BC. It doesn't really become a world power or anything very strong until the 14th century, 1400 to 1300 BC. Now, you throw those dates out, and sometimes people kind of go, So I'm going to throw the shorthand quick. It's very loose, but easy way to remember. 2000 is Abraham-ish. 1500 is Moses-ish. 1000 is David-ish. 500 is coming back from the captivity and near the end of the Old Testament. So when we say 2025 BC, that's around Abraham's time, not to this scale. The empire reached its height in about 700 BC, which would be a little after David and Solomon and all of that. They're known as the Assyrians, not to be confused with the Syrians, and there's some thought that meant the other Syrians. It just had to do with the area that they were in. The Syrians were in Damascus. Became an emperor in this. Its earliest conflicts actually involved fighting over what they called the ancient city of Nimrud, which if you go with Nimrud, what does that possibly sound a little like? Nimrod. Who was Nimrod? He was a great hunter. He was a very wise man. Why was he? That's weird. Why would you call someone, hey, you're a real smart dude, as an insult? That makes no a lot of times the use of that name as a pejorative, as an insult, it's kind of lost its meaning over time. The true insult was that he challenged God. He, traditionally at least, was considered the king of Babylon, old Babylon. We're talking Tower of Babel. And the idea of challenging God is foolish, so he acted foolishly when you were being a Nimrod in the sense that you were behaving foolishly. Over time, that just kind of become less specific and just more of a mean insult, but it's kind of funny. But the fact that the cities exist might be a connection to that. Let's see, Sargon II built a capital, then Sennacherib, who would be a figure that'll show up in the Old Testament around the time of Jeremiah. He built Nineveh. It's possible that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh and not Babylon. There's debate over that, whether it was Assyrian or Babylonian. So, conquered Babylon in 729, conquered Egypt in 671, came to its highest height. All this is going on. In the Bible, the biblical narrative, the flow of things, the Assyrians come down, and God uses them as a particular tool of judgment. And he destroys some of them. Who falls to the Assyrians? The northern kingdom. Sennacherib, I believe, is a part of that. And they actually manage to invade the southern kingdom, and they take a lot of territory. What happens with that whole campaign? Do the Assyrians win? How does it end? They try to capture Jerusalem. Are they successful? Well, they came into a siege, but then what happened? Jeremiah is there. Hezekiah is who I'm thinking of in. Jeremiah's later. Okay, I'm thinking Hezekiah in Chronicles. Because Jeremiah will be on the scene a little later. Hezekiah is king. He's doing okay. He finally decides to go to God. He should have started there. He prays. And in one night, the Assyrians lose over 100,000, like 120,000 troops. And they have to retreat. Now, if you go with the secular narrative, they kind of discount that. But it's interesting that this leader got assassinated pretty quickly, and there was a lot of internal strife. Now, if you're leading a brutal empire and you lose over 100,000 troops in a campaign, that kind of gives some impetus for some intrigue, right? They're at this great height. They're conquering everyone. They even subject Babylon, but they can't quite bring Babylon to heel. Then they challenge God. They go too far. They're brought low, and they can't handle the Babylonian problem. Babylon revolts, the Medes invade, and Nineveh falls in 614. Which then leads to actual Babylon. Babylon here, which will be at the time of Daniel, and he's interpreting this dream. Nebuchadnezzar is that particular figure there. Babylon lasts from 626 to about 539. That says 605. It all depends on when you want to count your starting points. They didn't manage to take Nineveh all the way and get rid of the Assyrians until a bit later, but their freedom began in 626. And the thing is, I have all these like, so-and-so revolts against someone, such and such. It's like, I don't know how we want to focus on these things. Because you got Nabopolassar, and the tests will be fun for this. He's the one who revolts. He's crowned king after 100 years of vassalism under the Assyrians. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, actually, marries a Median princess, Amytis. And this is where a lot of people think that he built the Hanging Gardens to please her, the traditional account of putting them in Babylon. The 7 wonders of the ancient world, we're kind of iffy on some of them. A couple of them are still around, but we're still iffy on them. But that would be that. What did the Babylonians manage to achieve that the Assyrians didn't? That concerns the Old Testament. okay. I mean, the Assyrians were pretty rough, although when Jonah was sent to them, they responded. True, they were pretty brutal. But Babylon will achieve something that they don't. So, yeah, they were able to take Judah and Benjamin over a series of campaigns. Now, to be fair, they went at it in increments. And Hezekiah is kind of a part fault for this, because he invited the Babylonian emissary into Jerusalem and showed off all the gold and everything that he had. And God was like, that was a really dumb choice. Guess what? This is going to be taken away from your descendants. And Hezekiah's going, as long as it doesn't come in my time, I can live happy. Thanks, dude. That's great. There's some social commentary right there. So they come in three different waves. The first and third third is the most intense. The first was pretty intense. They were bought off by being paid. The second they came, they paid them and also offered up slaves, in essence. That's where a lot of the children of nobility who were raised to be scribes and to engage in those kind of tasks, the men of letters, which Daniel was a part of. That's when he was most likely taken. And then in 586, they come, they sack the city, they destroy the Temple of Solomon, and they take a whole bunch into servitude. Not everyone, there's still some floating around in the land, because that always happens. They take the bulk of the population who they didn't kill back. They also went to campaign against Tyre, which is a city on the coast of the Mediterranean. At the time, it was an island. There was the coastal city of Tyre on the edge, and proper Tyre was on an island that was 800 meters from the land. And they just kind of holed up in this island and waited it out. So they sieged them for 13 years. After that, they decided, well, okay, we will become a vassal of you. Just leave the city alone. Tyre isn't touched. It won't be for a little while. Tyre was with the Phoenicians. Nebuchadnezzar has a son. He reigns 2 years. He's assassinated. Then a courtier, someone in the court, comes to power. His son comes in. That's Belshazzar, as we find in Daniel. They come to power. Belshazzar is left in charge of Babylon while his dad goes and campaigns more in the Levant, trying more away from, it might have been the sieging of Tyre and those different things around that area. The Levant is the Holy Land, in essence. And Cyrus of the Persians revolts against the Medes. He takes over from them. He invades Babylon. So we have the Babylonian Empire here at its height, and it looks very similar to Assyria, actually. Covers a lot of it, but I mean, that's a good amount of the known world. You don't tend to take, actually, I'll just use the pointer on this part here. Oh, come on. See if it'll show up for you. Or not, okay. You don't tend to take this area down here much, because that's the desert. But this, you have the Fertile Crescent in this area here. You have the trade routes coming up this way from the sea to there, over into the Indus. And this was the crossroads of the world for a large part. And there's a lot of ancient history here going back to the plains of Shinar. You've got where the Tower of Babel was, all those different things. And Babylon, she's big. And we kind of go, Like I said, before Assyria, nothing had been on this scale before. And then we start having these just big empires. Solomon had a large, at the height of Israel, had a lot of influence, but a lot of it was economic influence instead of direct influence. No one had gotten to these heights before. They also had real problems with administrating them, because you tend to overextend yourself, right? Well, Babylon was strong as long as she had a strong leader. Nebuchadnezzar was a strong king. Now, he became arrogant, and he challenges, he talks about how awesome he is, right? It's in Daniel. He says, I have become the greatest thing. And what happens to him? Yeah, he becomes unreasoning and wild. And the crazy thing to me is he isn't deposed or someone doesn't steal the throne from him while this happens. And I see God's interference in that because God's the one that causes it to happen. But I mean, all things being equal, the king's gone crazy. This is a great time to take over, but it doesn't happen. Because while Nebuchadnezzar wasn't exactly a nice, fun guy, he becomes an interesting little vessel here, that even he had this height, he was used as a tool of God to judge God's people, and when he's humbled and comes back, he goes and says, praise God, for he is the God Most High. And Nebuchadnezzar ends up writing a section in Aramaic of Daniel, a biblical author, technically. We don't tend to give him attribution for that, but he does. Because sometimes your best commentary can come from your enemies as opposed to your friends. But once he was gone, assassinated, and other ones came in, they didn't have the same, and we'll find this, there's usually a strong figure that holds everything together, and when they're gone, it just kind of falls apart. Belshazzar was weak in general. We find in Daniel that he's just spending his time partying. He will offend God by drinking wine and having things from the vessels of the. So what happens ends up being God's particular will, but it was bound to happen because he was also just not managing anything. Cyrus of the Persians rises up against the Medes because they were kind of in a thing. Then the Median army basically turned on their own king, sided with him, and helped him take over, and they kind of formed this empire. And then he invades Babylon. And famously, the Medes, Babylon was a tough nut to crack, high walls. How do you attack a city with high walls? Can't go over it. Can't go around. Oh, anyway. Yeah, that works. Siege warfare was they didn't have a whole lot in terms of, well, actually they had some pretty fancy equipment back then. They'd roll them in on logs, and they did have some ways of getting over the wall, but they actually came up with a simpler method, which shouldn't have worked. Here's the thing. On paper, this should not work. They diverted the entire river Euphrates around the city. They just dammed it up and diverted it so that the water level would go down so low that they just went under the wall on the riverbed where the river went through. Now, normally that shouldn't work because when that starts going down, someone in the city goes, hey, wait, something's up, and you send your army. But they were so busy having a party, they were drunk in the city when the Babylonians showed up. The Persians showed up to take Babylon. And that's the thing. In history, walls have been very effective deterrents, and it's many times the reason they've been overcome is through someone being paid to either open a gate, that worked with the Mongols, or through deception or some sort of form of trickery. What really happened with Troy is still kind of up in the air, but something along those lines. They probably bribed someone. So Babylon falls. There's another element to the thing that's interesting too. Nebuchadnezzar had been seen as a leader of the religion of Marduk, though he kind of minimized that after his experience. But the later rulers kind of didn't play the populist game with that. They tended to bring authority to themselves, and they displaced the pagan god. So from our perspective, it's a false god, so it's the big deal. But the people didn't like that. So when Cyrus shows up, and then Darius will show up, they will be seen as restoring Marduk to his place. And so they were welcomed. The people, the commoners, really weren't that upset about the change of things. And they actually formed a personal union for a while. Which leads us to, stop doing that, Persia. Medo-Persia. Also known as the Achaemenid Empire. Their quirks, they had some weird quirks. We'll find in Daniel that when the king makes a law, he can't rescind his own law. I don't know how that really works. You've got to have some way of changing things, because that could get really silly really fast. They had a different form of administration. They had what were called satraps, or basically governors of various things, over like 70 different provinces. They tried to administer this empire they took over better because they knew, see, when you're the guy who is a vassal that rises up in revolution, what are you afraid will happen to you? Somebody else can do it. So they tried to make sure that administrators were out there and keeping everyone generally happy. Daniel will get pulled into that. He's third in the kingdom, or second, third in the kingdom in Babylon the night it falls. Great, but after a while he's just pulled back into it, and he ends up being an administrator. That seems to be his thing, which made them jealous of him and all the things that led to the lion's den. He actually was befriended Darius, very close, and so forth. The Persian was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550, but Cyrus kind of leaves the scene, and Darius becomes kind of a figure that's big. And I really tried to distill a lot of this because it gets confusing fast. Because you have Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes the second, Artaxerxes the third, Artaxerxes the fourth, possibly a fifth, possibly another Xerxes, or it could be the same one. A Darius the third, a Darius the fourth. It's a tangled web. But in essence, these empires tend to do fine. You notice that it started to stretch a little further east because that's the realm from which a lot of the Medes came. Persia is kind of more what would be modern-day Iran, and they pulled into that. So they're getting close even to the Indus, to India. Darius had this ambition. And notice that we have moved a little further to the west. Before, we covered most of this area here. But now we're in Asia Minor and starting to get into Greece. It would be modern-day Turkey. The Persians were starting to push into Greek or Ionian lands. And Darius was fighting primarily Athens and was defeated in the Battle of Marathon, from which we get the name for the race. A runner ran the 26.2 miles, is that correct? And then gave the report and promptly died. I don't see why that's an exciting thing to want to replicate. I'm going to go run 26.2 miles and keel over. That sounds fun. But they were defeated, and it was the Persians that were trying to do it. Later, Xerxes I, his son, wanted to finish the job and wanted to totally invade Greece, and he is minorly defeated in Thermopylae, which is stylized among the Spartans and various things. It's actually a little more complicated because the Greeks weren't unified. They were all, there's a whole mess of stuff. He only gets so far. Artaxerxes, another one, comes along. He wants to undermine Athens, and he bribes other Greeks. They side with him to fight Athens. There's campaigns. Then they're fighting Sparta. Sparta doesn't like Athens. In the age, there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of changing of sides. They push in, and that's as far as they got, into Thrace and the areas there in Greece. But they started to get pushback from some little nobody prince. Just some guy. He was a prince of Macedonia, which is the northern area in Greece here. His father was Philip of Macedon. He inherited his father's throne, unified the Greeks, and pushed back the Persians, defeating Artaxerxes IV. Does anyone know who I'm talking about yet? Ow! We'll call him Xander. He became king of Macedon at 20 years old, succeeding his father, Philip II. He had been tutored until the age of 16 by Aristotle himself, which may have helped with his campaigns. He was very good with the use of tactics and various maneuver warfare that had not been seen in the world before. The Greeks had the hoplites, which had their usage, and they started to use catapults, and that uses a lot of math. And Aristotelian tried, and the trigonometry is useful with catapults and various things. I don't know if Pythagoras was in view either, too, but it's all there. It's all there. He becomes king of Macedon at 20. This is one of those things that we only know so much about, but it just kind of boggles the brain. There's a lot of legend we have to separate different things from. He becomes king of the lesser country at 20, right? By the time he is 30, he has conquered the largest empire in history, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. He wanted to extend his empire to reach, as is recorded, the ends of the world and the great outer sea. Not sure quite what that means. He might have been thinking the Indian Ocean, because he pushed into, again, to India in that realm. He campaigned all kinds of places. Born for war, he had the faith of his soldiers to the extreme level. There are a lot of, again, possibly true, possibly apocryphal stories told about Alexander. One such was when he was facing a city, that he was going to besiege this city, and they were deciding whether they wanted to capitulate or to put up a defense. He had his soldiers line up and start to march toward a cliffside. And several ranks marched right off the cliff to their deaths until he ordered the halt. The legend goes the city capitulated immediately because they understood these soldiers were so devoted to him that they would literally lemmingly walk off cliffs for the man. They would do anything. Again, that's debatable if that's true. In the intertestamental time, there was also supposed to be a possible account. I think this might be Josephus that brings this up, or one of the others, where Alexander visited Jerusalem after the restoration. They rebuilt the Second Temple. Under the Persians, with Artaxerxes later on sending Nehemiah and Ezra, they had a pretty fair time versus Babylon. They were in that captivity. Now they were sent back. They shifted to Persia while they were in captivity, and they were given a lot of funds, a lot of support, and encouragement even to work as governor and to worship their God for the glory of Persia. It was pretty hands-off. Well, the Persians were warring with Alexander. Alexander takes over. So you've got a new boss running around. It's kind of a mess. There's a story told that Alexander visited Jerusalem and read of himself, as he put it, in Daniel, this third kingdom, this great one, by name, and some other references. I think there's one in Isaiah. Greece is actually named by name in a certain place. Well, we translate it as such. It was supposed to be that region of the world from the Hebrew perspective. And he is supposed to have made a personal sacrifice to God in that honor. Whether that happened or not, it's interesting. Here's the problem, though. He was 20. He goes campaigning for 10 years. He gets as far as India. His soldiers get homesick. They finally get to the point of, okay, we're done. They start to give some pushback. He's worried about them, it's finally pushing back. They were very loyal, but it's getting to this campaign. So he starts heading home. He gets as far as Babylon, and he dies in 323 BC. It's not very old. He didn't have a successor. What happens now? What? See, that's the thing. This one figure, this strong figure, builds this up. He had several planned invasions that they never engaged in. He wanted to go further into Arabia, further into the north, into the Caucasus. He dies. So what we have, I kind of broke Greece up kind of in half here. You have Alexander's Greece, and then you have the post-Alexander Greece, which is more of a headache. Because there were a series of civil wars known as the Wars of the Diadochi. And the Diadochi was a name for his cadre of generals. He didn't have a son. He had fellow generals. Tradition holds, as in all those apocryphal stories, that on his deathbed they asked him, "To whom shall the glory of the empire go?" And he is said to have answered, "To the strongest." Again, whether that's true or not is up there. So you're broken into these various levels. And the strongest of them were the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies, which were located primarily, let's get the pointer, here in Egypt. They were settled heavily in Egypt. Around Alexandria. Alexander built about 20 cities. He named them after himself a lot of the time. Alexander was a big one. The Ptolemies were there. You have the Seleucids over here in a lot of what was the largely Persian Median area. You have Antigonus, which held kind of in Turkey and the Levant, although the Seleucids are going to come over and take over this area soon enough. And then you have the Cassanders and some back in Greece proper, which will never really get very far. They'll end up siding with Rome and then being eaten by Rome. But yeah, massive world-spanning empire, never been seen before, height of everything, and when its leader dies, fragmentation. And the drama between all these different kings is most likely what's being described in Daniel 11. We have the king of the north, and the king of the south, and the king of the east, and the king of the west, and blah, 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 blah. It's most likely these four kingdoms going bloop, 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 and all the intrigue that goes with them. It reads like a soap opera, and you need a flow chart to follow it, because it is insane. There are a series of Seleucid, that's Seleucus area here, Seleucid kings. I distilled a whole bunch. There were a lot of them named Antiochus. Antiochus III, who was Antiochus the Great, attempted to project into the Hellenistic Greece to take back a lot of this area here back, and he'd kind of eaten a lot of this. He'd avoided down here with Egypt, but he'd eaten a lot of this back. He wanted to kind of take the claim of the title back, but he was repulsed by the Greeks who allied with the Roman Republic at the time. And then Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, enters the scene. Antiochus Epiphanes. That's one of those vague names. Is anyone familiar with that at all? You're all just like, oh, okay. Antiochus IV. He warred with the Ptolemies down in Egypt. Jerusalem was kind of in this middle situation when this is all going on. The Greeks had brought Greek influence, the Hellenizing. We saw that with the Pharisees not wanting the youth to be associated with the Greek things. Alexander and his empire brought a lot of that. The Persians and the Babylonians, all they had left in terms of their imprint on the Jewish people is that they started speaking Aramaic. They kind of lost their language, but they stayed still pretty well distinct. And they were both Eastern in their thinking, so they were more similar in thought. The Greeks were a Western mindset. They brought a whole different worldview. They brought their polytheism, their philosophy, their various ways of looking at the world in, and it was Hellenizing things. So Jerusalem's caught in between this. They have these culture battles going on. They're caught in between these kings. One's this one, one's that one. And in these wars, they backed the Ptolemies in Egypt. And Antiochus didn't like that. So he came and he attacked Jerusalem. He slew a whole bunch of civilians. He caused a lot of damage. And he desecrated the temple. He offered swine on the altar itself in the Holy of Holies. And he cut them off from being able to make sacrifices for 3.5 years, which led to the Maccabean revolts, from which is recorded in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Those aren't inspired works. They take a little bit of liberties, but they're generally historic. This happens, and they're fighting with this. He ultimately leaves the east part of the empire to the Parthians there. They'll form their own. And then he's going to be defeated by the Roman general Pompey, same as the city, in 63 BC. As the Romans will start campaigning, the Republic and its high heir will start conquering places. The empire will carry that forward. So that leaves us with the fourth kingdom. And I would argue this is the one that most people know the most about. Rome. This is true. Why? Why is there more documentation? It's kind of a mixture. Because of the way the empire ended, and especially in the east, because it took a very long time, a lot of stuff was preserved, but here's the thing. The Romans were also obsessed with record keeping. Obsessed with it. They wrote down everything. So yeah, the SPQR, the Roman Empire, at her height, I think it was 30, 40% of the world's population, and sometimes the argument is higher. A good size of our population were slaves, but it's set that 117, about with the building of Hadrian's Wall, not long after the first century, was about the height of the Roman Empire. She would start to contract after this. There were some here and there gains among the lands of in Germany, with some of the barbarians there and so forth, but she just started to contract. How did Rome start? She was a kingdom. Tradition holds founded by Romulus. There's a couple differing ones. Much like the holder of the sword of Troy is said to have mythically escaped the city and founded Carthage, Romulus, or the first king, or Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned children that were fed by a giant wolf, that's another mythos, but probably just a king, founded the city. What's interesting is they had an area, even in Christ's day, by the first century, where Rome is the sprawling city of 7 hills, they had a district. They called it the Palatinate, which is a term for a palace, where you keep a palace. There was a Palatinate in Europe. But this area was kept rugged, and there was this old thatch, like wood log cabin, from our perspective, kind of house that was in Rome that they held. Now, whether or not it was true or not, they held had been the original residence of the founding king, and they kept it as this historical preserved site. It's kind of hilarious, because it's the very things that people do, right? We preserved our history. Was it real? I don't know, because it was founded as a kingdom about 753. That's a long time before. That's up in Italy, just founding the city. 753, that's back with the Assyrians. That's back with the divided kingdom. That's Old Testament back there. Rome wasn't, it was just a city, and it's so far removed from the perspective of all these empires that she just kind of went along doing her thing until her time. She was a kingdom until about 509. And then she became a republic with councils and a senate and all of that. And she was probably the best when she was a republic. She wasn't necessarily moral, but she was at least just, fair-ish. But in 27 BC, because of the actions of a certain man named Julius, actions in defense of the empire, he crossed the Rubicon and everything kind of changed. He crossed the Rubicon River, entered the city with an army to contest a possible revolt that would be damaging. He was doing the right thing, but he did it illegally, and it changed the nature of everything. They invested in him. the protections of being a dictator. The thing about the Roman system is during the Republic, they had dictators. They had them actually quite often. Whenever they had a major crisis, the Senate would get together and they would imbue on someone dictatorial powers for a set period of time to take care of the crisis. And usually that meant went off and killing somebody or defeating an army or dealing with a thing. And then they would come home and they would give up their dictatorial powers and then retire. Can you imagine? Hey, you get to be dictator for 2 years. Go do whatever you want. We can't stop you. What's the temptation there? It worked pretty well when they picked relatively good people. Problem was they didn't always let go of it. Now there's an argument and debate over whether Julius didn't want to give it up or because he felt he couldn't give it up because the corruption had become so bad. Either which way, he was assassinated in 44 BC by those that saw his power as a threat. This faction was then chased away and defeated by his adopted son, Octavian, and Mark Antony in 42. Mark Antony and Octavian were going to divide the Roman world for a little while. That didn't last very long. They had a squabble. Mark Antony went to Cleopatra for help and was defeated by Octavian. When he had hold of the whole thing, he was given the title Augustus, which means venerated, and made princeps, meaning foremost, and the imperial line was born with Octavian, or Caesar Augustus. His son Tiberius inherited it, and it created that inheritance line through the Julian line going up until Nero, I believe. All this is going on. While God's people are taken into captivity, released, the world's changing around them. New culture comes in, new language. All things that were promised to Daniel in 600, 580 something, possibly 590. Why did God have all these kingdoms come and go? What was the point of it all? That's kind of an open question. There's necessarily a right answer, but why? Up until this point, you'd had all these different little groups. Egypt had been stronger in the past and such, but nothing like this. All right, Grover, you had a... What was he setting the stage for? Okay, but why would having these empires help with that, or these kingdoms? I mean, you could say he's calling his shots with the statue in the time of the fourth kingdom. And we're talking, could you imagine, that you're living in one of those kingdoms, and you're already saying there's going to be another one, and another one. Wait, what? No, as far as Babylon's concerned, and telling Nebuchadnezzar this, oh, by the way, you're the head, but guess what? Your kingdom's not going to last, dude. You think you're the greatest power that is? You know... What, is he just calling his shots? What is the point of having all these empires rise and fall, ones that the world hadn't really seen on this scale before?
Well, it set up unity within the whole population of the world, where as there was an empire, then there was a unified presence, even though it may have been disgruntled, it may have been rebelled against, but it was still unified, and each process developed something within that.
Yes.
That's where the fullness of time in Galatians talks about.
Mm-hmm.
All of the events led up to, I know that I understand the developing of the Aramaic, the Greek, to where it was a universal language. They could speak the same language anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The Romans built the road so we could go anywhere in the world. It was all processed until, and then Jesus came. Now, that the whole purpose was, when you're talking about it split up by, the way we know it is the patriarchal age, where each family had their own pod, their own location, their own existence. And so within time, these people were all self-sustained as families, not countries and not nationalities. groups.
Well, they were separated by language back at Babel. I mean, coming off the boat, and yeah, and so, well,
Well, I know, now I understand.
the boat, the barge.
The big boat. Anyway, but I mean, the establishment of a unified population where people were comfortable with other people and they were able to interact and exist with other people.
Yeah. And what you were bringing up, each of these empires brings a differing element to it. Nebuchadnezzar brought kind of this uniformity with Babylon that was just new, this just established systemology. And you're right, they were more tolerant than the Assyrians. They weren't great, but they kind of spread this culture and brought that that Aramaic identity, which was something that the Jews took on. But there were certain religious components. It was during that captivity that we best understand they created the synagogue system, where they started to band together and started taking things a little more seriously because they had forgotten it for so long, and they were cured of idolatry. That was their biggest problem. The Persians...
I use the word tolerant because, Nebuchadnezzar set up the Temple of Marduk, that they had different rooms within each one where they had the sacred emblems from the different countries that they'd taken, so that your God is still a God, and we still recognize your God, but he's not as powerful as Marduk.
Yeah, they were very polytheistic in that nature. Yeah. Now that he could be influenced, because like the issue with every time you hear a sound of an instrument with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that tended to work against those that...
Right, but I mean the idea that within the tolerance of, we're going to recognize your God so that you're not offended.
Yep. The Persians brought in a degree of bureaucracy. I mean, the Romans were big on that, but they created a lot of systemology and this rule of law notion that hadn't really existed that much, because the king's rule was law. The idea, it's so weird that's like when the Persian king issues an edict that can't be undone even by himself is a challenge that was unheard of generally. Now, it wasn't new, because under the old law, even the king, say David, was beholden to the law as God structured it, but that was different. And so that might have been an influence there. The Greeks definitely bringing their Greek language and Greek culture that was more useful for the gospel progression and sharing. And the Romans with their infrastructure and Pax Romana is the big one, the Roman peace. There wasn't piracy, there wasn't brigandry or robbery on a grand scale. It still happened, but it was heavily lessened. You could move about the empire, especially a Roman citizen like Paul, relatively easily, which had not been the norm in the ancient world. There was a lot of upward mobility when you think, well, they didn't have cars and planes. They had their feet, they had carts, they had ships. They moved about. Yeah. So, yeah. And it did. It reached these places. Now, again, the Romans will eventually co-opt it, and there's issues that come historically there. But yeah. Now, one other honorable mention in all of this that isn't one of them was Carthage, which was formed on that tip there, like around this area, and then had influence with a bunch of colonies. That was a Phoenician from Tyre. The Phoenicians, also Philistines, but Phoenicians, they settled here after a while because I mentioned Tyre before. Tyre was an island at one time. Alexander came and didn't just stand there for 13 years. He had his armies collect rubble and stones and literally make a bridge of rocks out to the island and turned it into a peninsula and changed the entire topography of that area as it still exists today and sacked the city. A lot of them fled to Carthage. Carthage was the thorn in the side of Rome's side. Rome had to defeat her to be prime. And if it weren't for a couple battles going a few ways, a Pyrrhic victory here and there, marching elephants, and then a lot of sort of weird stuff, she needs to be included because without her being destroyed, you wouldn't have this. But she just doesn't get as much attention. Okay, so we get back to this. We're at about time, so I want to bring this last thought. We looked at these, okay, these are all those kingdoms. And this chart is helpful. But I mean, even in your Bible, you'll have little heads. Medo-Persia and Greece. After this will rise to you another kingdom inferior to you, another third kingdom abroad, which will rule over the earth. Verse 40 of Daniel 2. And the header says, Rome. Then there'll be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so that iron breaks in pieces. It will crush and break all these in pieces. And so that in this, that you saw the feet of toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom. It will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw iron mixed with common clay. And then the toes. That's Rome. The kingdom came. So what do you do if you want to teach that the kingdom doesn't come until the end times? How do you deal with this? This has always been a question of mine. I'm like, it's right there. God called the shots. You look at the beast, same thing. And they mirror a lot of what happens in the Revelation. You're like, it's all right there. Well, you end up with charts, and these are not correct. But these were images that I just found on a Google search where, oh, yeah, it's like that. But you see, it breaks up the toes. You see, Rome is the legs, but the toes are future powers. It doesn't say that in the text. Or the toes are the New World Order. Yeah, this is a fun one. Theocracy, democracy, yeah. You have to make it allegorical. But a lot of them, I saw one where it says Holy Roman Empire. You have to break apart the elements that are there, because this lays out that in this particular time, a rock not built with human hands, there goes something not built by man, was going to come down, crush that statue, and be a kingdom established that would never be destroyed. And that's the thing about all these other kingdoms. They had great power. They had great height. They had great authority, but do they still exist? What happened to Rome? Depending on how you want to count it, and that's a big how you want to count it kind of thing, the unified empire survived until about AD 395. There reaches a particular point where Constantine moved the capital over to Constantinople, not Istanbul. Well, actually, it's not Constantinople, over in Turkey. And then there was divided power between emperors at a certain point because they couldn't hold it together, and there was a Western and an Eastern one. And eventually the Western one waned, fell in 476, 480, somewhere in there, depending on how we want to count it. The Visigoths took over. That Eastern empire became what was known as Byzantium. And Constantinople would not fall until the Ottomans sacked the city in 1453. But she still fell. Is it the same empire? That's a huge debate. I say no, but there's a lot. It became the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither holy nor Roman nor empire. None of these things built by man, which served God's purposes, lasted. But the stone which came, the kingdom established, not built by human hands, endures forever. That's talking about the kingdom. That's talking about Christ. That's talking about the church. And this was shared with the world through an interpretation of a dream by a scribe who was a slave. He's a scribe, but he's still a slave, to a king 600-ish years before it would be fully fulfilled. Why? Because this is how it was always going to be. I don't know. I was trying to provide some background on those kingdoms. We seriously could do this for forever. I don't want to. But there are all kinds of little things. We hear about Babylon, Persia, and all of them. I just wanted to kind of bring them out. Any thoughts, comments, questions, issues, regards, complaints? Anything? That was kind of a thing we could look at tonight. Okay. Is there anything that needs mentioned this evening? Certainly. Thanks to Brady, Chris, and Randy for doing all that hard work on the baptistry. Nice and clean and clear of any issues, and we'll be back up and running. Hard work for sometimes the seemingly simple things can be very hard to get to be as they should. And a lot of hard work went into that. So thank you. We've got the meal on Wednesday. There's the men's breakfast on Saturday. Does anyone need to partake of the Lord's Supper this evening? Okay. Anything else that needs mentioned? Speak now or just mention it after the prayer? All right, if you would, let's go to our Father in prayer and we'll close up. Father, we thank you for this time to look at nations, that empires, power, all things that were allowed to occur and did so because of your hand and your doing, all to bring about something much more grand. Lord, we just pray that we always remember that you're in control and that your Son has the greatest authority over heaven and earth right now. And no matter what this world sends our way, it's just the world. And we can find strength in you. Help us to be wise in our choices and wise in how we walk each day, to be good citizens, but also to remember where our citizenship ultimately lies. Lord, we thank you for times to discuss and to share and to study and to talk. And we know we're not promised that. We thank you for giving us safe, and we ask for more of that. Please, as we go back into this world throughout this week, help us to be mindful and encouragement to one another, to lean on each other as we lean on you, and to be safe, if it be your will, but most importantly, to be wise. There are many with illnesses, with emotional challenges. Lord, we pray that they can be made well, that they can be made to be at peace, but that most importantly, anyone who is struggling spiritually can be strengthened. We thank you for your Son, for your patience, for life, for hope, for meaning. Keep us focused, forgive us, we stray too often. Be with us. It's in your Son's name we pray.